The summer air hung heavy over the Neman River as I stood among 600,000 souls, each breathing the same anticipation, the same uncertainty that would define the months ahead. My name matters little now, for I was merely one thread in the vast tapestry that Napoleon had woven from the corners of Europe. French, Italian, German, Polish voices mingled in the pre-dawn darkness, creating a symphony of languages that somehow harmonized into a single, collective heartbeat. I remember the weight of my musket against my shoulder, the familiar press of my pack against my spine, and the way the leather of my boots had already begun to soften with the morning dew. Around me, men checked their equipment one final time, running calloused fingers over cartridge boxes, adjusting the fit of their shakos, whispering prayers in tongues I could not understand but whose meaning was universal. We were about to cross a river, but we all sensed we were crossing something far more profound, a threshold from which there might be no return. The emperor himself had arrived before sunrise, his gray overcoat unmistakable even in the pale light. There was something magnetic about his presence, the way conversations fell to whispers when he passed, how even the horses seemed to step more carefully. I had seen him before, of course, at Austerlitz, at Jena, but never like this. Never with such an enormous force gathered at his command. Never with such ambition written in the set of his shoulders and the forward lean of his gaze across the water toward Russia. 600,000 men. The number still seems impossible, even now, years later, when I close my eyes and try to count the faces I remember. The Grande Armée stretched along the riverbank like a living thing, breathing and shifting, its components as diverse as the continent from which it was drawn. There were the old guard veterans whose scars told stories of a dozen campaigns. Their blue uniforms faded, but their discipline sharp as their bayonets. Young conscripts from Bavarian villages stood beside Polish lancers whose grandfathers had charged with King Sobieski. Italian grenadiers shared their bread with Saxon infantrymen, while Dutch artillery crews checked their cannon for the 100th time. The pontoon bridges had been under construction for weeks, their wooden planks stretching across the dark water like fingers reaching toward an unknown shore. Engineers worked through the night, their hammers creating a rhythmic percussion that seemed to keep time with our collective pulse. The sound echoed off the water, returned to us changed, as if the river itself was trying to warn us of what lay ahead. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the order came to begin the crossing. I watched as the lead elements of the army began their march across those narrow bridges, their boots creating a hollow drumbeat on the wooden planks. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, the rhythm of invasion, the metronome of ambition. My own regiment was not among the first to cross. We waited, as soldiers always wait, watching others move toward their destiny, while we remained suspended in that strange liminal space between peace and war, between the known and the unknown. I used that time to study the landscape around us, to memorize details that would later seem precious beyond measure. The way the morning mist rose from the water in delicate spirals, the sound of birds in the trees along the riverbank, their songs indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, the smell of wood smoke from the cooking fires, mixed with leather and metal and the earthy scent of so many men gathered in one place. The river itself was unremarkable, not particularly wide, not especially deep, its banks soft with summer grass. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant place for a picnic, somewhere lovers might come to watch the sunset. Instead, it had become the gateway to the largest military adventure in European history. Napoleon had chosen this moment, this place, with the same calculating precision he brought to every battlefield. The timing was perfect. Russia was distracted by its war with Turkey. The weather was favorable, and our supply lines stretched back to magazines that groaned under the weight of accumulated provisions. But as I stood there, watching company after company disappear into the Russian vastness, I began to understand that this campaign would be different from all the others. In previous wars, we had fought on familiar ground, against enemies whose capabilities we understood, in countries where the distance between battles could be measured in days rather than weeks. Here, the very geography seemed to swallow our columns whole. The forests that began just beyond the river stretched toward horizons that seemed to recede as we approached them. The roads, what few there were, looked more like suggestions than actual routes of march. When our turn finally came, I stepped onto that first pontoon bridge with a mixture of excitement and dread that I can still taste in my mouth. The planks sagged slightly under our weight, and the bridge swayed gently with the current. Below us, the dark water of the Neman flowed steadily westward, back toward the lands we were leaving behind. I found myself wondering if it was trying to tell us something, this river that flowed away from our destination, as if nature itself was suggesting we reconsider our course. The crossing took most of the day. 600,000 men cannot move quickly, even when spread across multiple bridges, even when driven by Napoleon's impatience. We moved in waves, like a tide of blue and green and white uniforms, each wave taking its turn to step from the familiar ground of Poland into the mysterious expanse of Russia. As each man crossed, he became part of something larger than himself, part of an enterprise that would test every assumption we had made about war, about distance, about the limits of human endurance. I remember looking back once, halfway across, to see the endless column of men still waiting their turn. They stretched back along the riverbank as far as I could see, a human river flowing toward the wooden bridges. Somewhere in that mass were friends I had made during the long march from France, comrades who had shared their wine and their stories around countless campfires. I tried to memorize their faces, though I did not yet know why this seemed important. On the Russian side, the landscape opened before us like a vast book written in a language we could not read. The trees were different, birch and pine instead of the oak and chestnut we knew from home. The grass grew in different patterns. The flowers bloomed in unfamiliar colors. Even the sky seemed larger somehow, as if the dome of heaven had been stretched to accommodate the enormity of the land beneath it. There were no welcoming crowds, no cities visible on the horizon, no obvious objectives that would allow us to measure our progress. Our first night on Russian soil was strangely quiet. We had expected resistance at the river crossing, perhaps a battle to mark our entry into enemy territory. Instead, we found only emptiness. The Russian forces had withdrawn deeper into their homeland, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more unsettling than any cannonade would have been. We pitched our tents in fields that showed no sign of recent cultivation, near villages that seemed to have been abandoned without haste or panic, as if their inhabitants had simply melted away like morning frost. The campfires that night created islands of light and warmth in the vast darkness of the Russian steppe. Around each fire, men gathered to share their rations and their thoughts about what lay ahead. The veterans spoke with confidence born of experience, recounting tales of previous campaigns where swift marches and decisive battles had brought quick victory. The younger soldiers listened with wide eyes, eager to prove themselves worthy of the Grand Army's legendary reputation. But there were other conversations too, quieter ones conducted in small groups or between old friends. Some men spoke of letters they had written but not yet sent, of sweethearts waiting in distant villages, of fields that would need harvesting in the autumn. Others discussed the strange quality of the Russian light, the way it seemed to reveal and conceal simultaneously, or the unsettling absence of birds in the trees around our camp. Napoleon himself moved among the fires that night, stopping to speak with officers and common soldiers alike. I was close enough to hear him address a group of young conscripts from Westphalia, telling them that they were making history, that their names would be remembered alongside those of Alexander and Caesar. His voice carried easily in the still air, filled with the confidence that had carried him from Corsica to the throne of Europe. When he spoke of Moscow, of the submission of the Tsar, of the peace that would follow our inevitable victory, it was impossible not to believe him. Yet as I lay in my tent that night, listening to the gentle sounds of 600,000 men settling into sleep, I found myself thinking about the river we had crossed. The Neman continued to flow westward, back toward the lands we knew, indifferent to our grand designs. In years to come, I would often dream of that dark water, carrying with it whispers of warning that we were too intoxicated with our own ambition to hear. The morning of June 25th dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the beginning of a campaign. As we broke camp and formed up for the march eastward, the army spread out across the landscape like a flood seeking its natural course. The roads, such as they were, could not accommodate such numbers, so we moved across country, through fields and forests, following compass bearings toward objectives that existed more in Napoleon's imagination than on any map. I marched with my company in the 3rd Corps, somewhere in the middle of that vast procession. Ahead of us and behind us, the columns stretched beyond the limits of vision, raising dust clouds that hung in the still air like banners marking our passage. The sound of our march was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not just the rhythm of boots on earth, but the creak of leather, the rattle of equipment, the snorting of horses, the rumble of artillery wheels, all blended into a continuous symphony of movement that seemed to make the very ground vibrate beneath our feet. As we moved deeper into Russia, the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The forests grew denser, the clearings smaller. The few roads we encountered were narrower than those we had known in Western Europe, and they seemed to lead not toward destinations but simply away from where we were. Villages, when we found them, were small and primitive by the standards we were accustomed to. Their log houses clustered around wooden churches whose onion domes caught the sunlight like scattered coins. But what struck me most forcefully during those first days was the silence of the country itself. In France, in Italy, in Germany, the countryside was alive with the sound of human activity. Church bells, market day bustle, the calls of merchants and farmers. Here, the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something we could not name. Even the wildlife was different. The birds were fewer and more cautious. The domestic animals seemed to have been driven away ahead of our advance, and the very air carried scents that were unfamiliar. Pine and birch, wild herbs we could not identify, and underneath it all, something that might have been the smell of vast distances. Our supply situation, which had been meticulously planned for months, began to show strain almost immediately. The magazines that had been established along our line of advance proved inadequate for the numbers actually crossing into Russia. More critically, the assumption that we would be able to live off the land, a strategy that had worked well in the fertile regions of Western Europe, proved overly optimistic in this sparsely populated wilderness. The villages we encountered had little surplus food to offer, and what they did have was often hidden or destroyed before our arrival. By the end of our first week in Russia, men were already beginning to fall out of the ranks. Not from battle, we had yet to see a single Russian soldier, but from exhaustion, disease, and the simple difficulty of maintaining such enormous numbers in motion across such challenging terrain. The field hospitals began to fill with men suffering from dysentery, fever, and infected blisters. Horses, essential for our cavalry and artillery, began to die at an alarming rate, victims of poor fodder and the strain of pulling heavy equipment across rough ground. Yet Napoleon pressed forward with undiminished confidence. Each evening, as the army settled into its camps, couriers arrived with reports from our scouts. The Russian forces under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration were retreating steadily eastward, apparently unwilling or unable to offer battle. This seemed to confirm the emperor's strategic assumptions. One decisive engagement would force the Tsar to sue for peace, and the campaign would be over before the onset of winter. I remember one evening, perhaps 10 days after crossing the Neman, when I found myself on guard duty at the edge of our camp. It was a clear night, and the stars seemed closer and brighter than they ever had at home. In the distance, I could see the glow of other campfires, hundreds of them, marking the positions of our various corps across the landscape. It was a magnificent sight, proof of the incredible power that Napoleon had assembled and was now directing toward the heart of Russia. But as I stood there, musket in hand, listening to the night sounds of the vast army settling into sleep, I began to sense something that would haunt me throughout the months ahead. The land around us was not just empty, it was patient. It waited with a kind of eternal stillness that made our torches and our campfires seem small and temporary. The darkness beyond our lights was not hostile exactly, but it was vast beyond comprehension, and it seemed to possess a quality that no amount of human will or ambition could alter. In the days that followed, we continued our advance toward Vilna, then toward Vitebsk, always following the retreating Russians, always expecting the great battle that would justify our enormous enterprise. The weather remained favorable, warm days and cool nights that made marching pleasant for those whose equipment and health permitted them to keep up with the pace. But with each passing day, the army grew smaller, not from combat losses, but from the steady attrition of distance and hardship. Men began to drop out of the columns in increasing numbers, some to illness, others to desertion, many simply to exhaustion. The carefully maintained formations that had crossed the Neman began to stretch and thin, leaving gaps that could not be filled. Supply wagons broke down or became mired in the primitive roads, forcing difficult decisions about what equipment to abandon and what to salvage. The emperor himself seemed immune to these concerns, or perhaps he simply refused to acknowledge them. He maintained his grueling pace, moving from corps to corps in his traveling carriage, issuing orders that assumed capabilities we no longer possessed, setting objectives that presumed a level of logistical support that was becoming increasingly fictional. When reports reached him of units falling behind schedule, of supply shortages, of growing sick lists, he responded with the same mixture of encouragement and impatience that had served him well in previous campaigns. But Russia was not previous campaigns. Each day took us further from our bases, deeper into a landscape that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. The forests grew thicker, the roads worse, the villages smaller and more widely scattered. And always, ahead of us, the Russian forces retreated in good order, burning what they could not carry, leaving behind a calculated emptiness that began to feel more like a trap than a retreat. As June turned toward July, I began to understand that we were no longer simply following an enemy army. We were being drawn into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The Russia that was revealing itself to us bore little resemblance to the country Napoleon had described in his proclamations to the army. This was not a European nation that could be conquered through swift marches and decisive battles. This was something older, larger, and more patient than anything we had encountered before. The sun that had blessed our crossing of the Neman continued to shine, but now its warmth felt different against our faces. We were no longer marching toward a familiar kind of victory. We were walking into a vast silence that seemed to echo with promises we could not understand, following roads that led toward horizons that receded as we approached them. Behind us, the Neman continued its eternal flow westward, carrying with it reflections of the bridges we had crossed and the certainties we had left behind. Part 2. Smolensk and the Fire of Retreat, July-August 1812. July arrived with a heat that seemed to rise not just from the sun above but from the very earth beneath our feet. The Russian summer, which had initially seemed like a blessing after the cool dampness of spring, now became another adversary in our growing list of challenges. The dust kicked up by 600,000 pairs of boots hung in the air like a constant fog, coating our uniforms, our equipment, our faces with a fine gray powder that turned to mud when mixed with sweat and made every breath a conscious effort. By now, we had been marching for nearly a month, and the transformation of our magnificent army was becoming impossible to ignore. What had crossed the Neman as the finest military force Europe had ever assembled was beginning to resemble something quite different. A long, struggling procession of increasingly desperate men, stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, held together more by habit and fear than by the iron discipline that had once made us invincible. I remember the morning when we first caught sight of Smolensk's ancient walls rising above the Dnieper River. After weeks of chasing phantoms through empty forests and abandoned villages, here at last was something substantial, something that looked like the kind of objective we understood how to attack. The city's white stone walls and golden church domes caught the morning light like a promise of real battle, real resolution, real progress toward whatever ending awaited us in this vast country. But even as we approached this first major Russian stronghold, the pattern that would define our entire campaign was already becoming clear. The closer we came to engagement, the more elusive our enemies became. Bagration's army, which our scouts had reported to be defending the city, seemed to melt away like morning mist as we deployed for assault. Where we expected to find prepared positions and massed artillery, we found only rear guards and delaying actions, carefully calculated to inflict just enough casualties to remind us that we were not alone in this wilderness. The siege of Smolensk, when it finally began, felt like a return to familiar ground. Here were walls to breach, batteries to position, approaches to plan and execute. For the first time since crossing the Neman, we had a clear objective and a definite enemy. The artillery barrage that commenced on August 16th echoed across the countryside with the authority we had been craving. Each cannon shot a statement of purpose that seemed to push back against the oppressive silence that had surrounded us for so long. I was assigned to one of the assault columns that attacked the city's western wall. As we formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, checking our muskets and fixing our bayonets, I felt a familiar mixture of fear and excitement that I had not experienced since leaving Poland. This was what we had trained for, what we understood. The chaos of battle, the clarity of immediate objectives, the simple arithmetic of advance or retreat, victory or defeat. But when the assault began, something felt wrong from the very first moments. The Russian resistance was fierce but brief, their counterattacks sharp but quickly abandoned. They fought like men who were buying time rather than defending ground, and when our columns finally breached the outer defenses, we found ourselves advancing through a city that was already beginning to burn. The fires had been set systematically, professionally. This was not the random destruction of a panicked retreat, but a calculated policy implemented with the same precision the Russians had shown in all their movements since we crossed the border. Storehouses, government buildings, anything that might be useful to an occupying army, all of it was methodically destroyed before our eyes. The smoke rose in thick black columns that merged overhead into a pall that blocked out the sun and turned day into a kind of gray twilight. As we advanced through the burning streets, our boots crunching on broken glass and debris, I began to understand what we were truly facing. This was not an enemy who would stand and fight for territory, who would defend positions that could be taken and held. This was something far more dangerous, an enemy who was willing to destroy what they could not keep, who saw their own land as expendable in service of some larger strategy we could not yet comprehend. The Russian soldiers we encountered in the burning city fought with a grim determination that was somehow different from the martial enthusiasm we had faced in previous campaigns. They did not retreat because they were beaten, but because retreat was part of their plan. They did not defend the city because they valued its preservation, but because resistance served their purposes. When they finally withdrew across the Dnieper, leaving us masters of a burning ruin, it felt less like a victory than like a successful trap. That night, as we camped among the smoldering ruins of Smolensk, the full implications of what we had witnessed began to sink in. The Russians were not simply avoiding battle, they were transforming the very nature of the conflict. Instead of defending fixed positions that could be captured and used, they were creating a wasteland that offered nothing to their enemies except the satisfaction of having advanced another few miles deeper into an increasingly hostile wilderness. The supplies we had hoped to find in Smolensk's warehouses were ashes. The shelter we had anticipated in its buildings was rubble. The local population that might have provided labor and intelligence had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. We had won a battle, taken a city, advanced our lines, and found ourselves worse off than before we began. Napoleon himself seemed shaken by what we had found, though he did his best to hide it from the army. I saw him standing in the ruins of Smolensk's cathedral, staring at the charred remains of what had once been ornate religious artwork, his face wearing an expression I had never seen before. Not defeat, exactly, but a kind of puzzled frustration, as if he were trying to solve a problem that kept changing its nature every time he thought he understood it. The emperor's proclamations to the army continued to speak of inevitable victory, of the submission of the Tsar, of the peace that would follow our advance to Moscow. But those of us who had fought through the burning streets could hear something different in his voice now, a note of uncertainty that had not been there when we crossed the Neman. The Russians were not playing by the rules of European warfare, and Napoleon, for all his genius, seemed uncertain how to respond to an enemy who refused to behave as enemies were supposed to behave. The heat of August intensified as we pushed beyond Smolensk, and with it came new torments that tested our endurance in ways that no amount of training could have prepared us for. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, turning our metal equipment too hot to touch and making each step an act of will. At night, the temperature dropped suddenly, leaving us shivering in the same uniforms that had been unbearable just hours before. Thunderstorms appeared with shocking suddenness, turning the primitive roads into rivers of mud that swallowed wagons whole and left men struggling to maintain their footing under the weight of their packs. But it was not just the weather that wore us down during those terrible weeks after Smolensk. It was the growing realization that we were no longer advancing toward victory, but being drawn deeper into a trap whose dimensions we could not see. Every mile we marched eastward took us further from our bases, further from any hope of resupply, further into a country that seemed determined to consume us through the simple expedient of its own vastness. The foraging parties that were sent out to supplement our dwindling rations returned with increasingly discouraging reports. The countryside had been systematically stripped of anything that might feed an army. Granaries had been emptied or burned, livestock driven away, wells poisoned or destroyed. Even the wild game seemed to have vanished, as if the very animals understood that this land had become a place of death and had fled to safety beyond our reach. Disease began to spread through the ranks with alarming speed. Dysentery, typhus, and fever claimed more men each day than all the Russian bullets we had faced since crossing the border. The field hospitals became overcrowded charnel houses where exhausted surgeons worked without adequate supplies to treat conditions that grew worse with each passing day. Men who had marched proudly across the Neman began to fall out of the columns in increasing numbers, some to die by the roadside, others to struggle along as best they could, hoping to catch up when their strength returned. The horses suffered even more than the men. Without adequate fodder, pulling heavy artillery and supply wagons across increasingly difficult terrain, they began to die in horrifying numbers. I watched cavalry units that had been the pride of their regiments reduced to infantry as their mounts collapsed and could not be replaced. Artillery pieces that had thundered across a dozen European battlefields were abandoned for lack of animals to pull them, their bronze barrels left to rust in Russian fields like monuments to our diminishing capabilities. Yet still we marched eastward, following roads that led toward Moscow and the decisive battle that Napoleon insisted would end the campaign. The very name of that ancient city had taken on an almost mystical quality in our conversations around the evening campfires. Moscow, where the Tsar would finally be forced to acknowledge our superiority. Moscow, where the wealth of Russia would compensate for all our sacrifices. Moscow, where this terrible march through an empty wilderness would finally be revealed to have had meaning and purpose. But those of us who had fought at Smolensk began to harbor darker thoughts. If the Russians were willing to burn their own historic city rather than let us use it, what would they do when we reached their ancient capital? If they could abandon Smolensk's wealth and strategic position as casually as they had abandoned the villages and towns we had passed through, what made us think they would defend Moscow any differently? The nights grew longer as August progressed toward September, and with the changing season came a psychological shift that was even more dangerous than our physical deterioration. The boundless confidence that had carried us across the Neman was being replaced by something harder to define. Not quite fear, not yet despair, but a growing awareness that we had committed ourselves to an enterprise whose outcome was no longer within our control. I remember one night in particular, when I was assigned to sentry duty at the perimeter of our camp. The usual sounds of 600,000 men settling into sleep had given way to something quieter, more subdued. Conversations around the campfires were shorter, more serious. Men wrote letters they were not sure would ever be delivered, checked and rechecked equipment that might have to last for months longer than originally planned. As I walked my post in the darkness, I could see other sentries at their positions, dark figures outlined against the glow of dying fires. Beyond them, the Russian night stretched away in all directions, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to our presence. Somewhere out there, Russian armies were moving according to plans we could not anticipate, following strategies that turned our own strength against us. The very emptiness of the land had become a weapon more effective than any cannon. The stars above seemed different than they had at home. Not brighter or dimmer, but arranged in patterns that reminded me how far we had come from everything familiar. The North Star, which had guided us eastward for so many weeks, now seemed less like a beacon pointing toward victory and more like a cold eye watching our struggles with cosmic indifference. When dawn came, we would continue our march toward Moscow, following roads that grew worse with each passing day, sustained by rations that grew scarcer with each passing week. Napoleon would ride among the columns, his presence still inspiring confidence in some, his voice still promising triumph over all obstacles. But those of us who had seen Smolensk burn knew that we were no longer the same army that had crossed the Neman in June. We had won every engagement, taken every objective, advanced according to every plan. And yet, with each victory, we found ourselves weaker, more isolated, more dependent on an outcome that seemed to recede before us like a mirage in the shimmering heat of the Russian summer. Every step forward was a step deeper into a country that was transforming us from conquerors into prey, from the masters of Europe into wanderers in a wilderness that offered no mercy to those who had come uninvited to its depths. The smoke from Smolensk had long since dissipated, but its message hung over us like a permanent cloud. This was what awaited us at every city, every town, every village between here and Moscow. Fire and emptiness, destruction and silence, the systematic elimination of everything that might sustain an invading army. We were not marching toward victory. We were walking into a furnace whose heat would only intensify as we approached its heart. Part 3. Borodino. The Day of Blood, September 7, 1812. September arrived with a crispness in the air that whispered of the winter still months away, but close enough now to cast its shadow over our calculations and our dreams. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the endless Russian forests in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now, they served only as reminders of time's passage, of the season advancing toward cold that would make our current hardships seem like fond memories. For weeks, we had been pursuing the elusive Russian armies through the countryside west of Moscow, always a day behind, always finding abandoned camps still warm with the ashes of their fires. Our scouts brought reports of two major forces, Kutuzov's main army and the separate corps that had been shadowing our advance. But they moved like smoke, visible one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only the evidence of their passage and the systematic destruction that had become their signature. Then, on September 5th, everything changed. Our advance guard encountered something they had not seen since crossing the Neman. Russian soldiers who did not retreat at the first sight of our columns. Instead, they fought stubbornly for every position, falling back only when forced, and then only to prepared positions further back. It was as if the Russian command had finally decided that the time for running was over. I remember the excitement that rippled through our depleted ranks when word spread that the enemy was finally offering battle. After months of chasing shadows, we would have our chance to settle this campaign the way campaigns were supposed to be settled, with a decisive engagement that would demonstrate once and for all which army was superior. Napoleon himself seemed transformed by the news, his old energy returning as he rode among the troops, his voice carrying the confidence that had made him master of Europe. The position the Russians had chosen was formidable, a series of hills and ridges stretching across the main road to Moscow, anchored by the village of Borodino and dominated by a great redoubt that crowned the central heights. Through my field glass, I could see the earthworks bristling with artillery, the dark masses of infantry formed up behind carefully prepared defenses, the cavalry positioned to exploit any breakthrough or cover any retreat. This was not the hasty rearguard action we had grown accustomed to, but a deliberate attempt to stop our advance through the simple expedient of making it too costly to continue. Kutuzov had chosen his ground well. The position was too strong to carry by direct assault, too extensive to outflank easily, too well prepared to surprise. If we wanted to reach Moscow, we would have to pay for the privilege in blood, and the price would be higher than anything we had faced since the beginning of the campaign. The night before the battle was unlike any I had experienced in all my years of soldiering. There was none of the usual nervous energy that precedes a major engagement, none of the excited speculation about tomorrow's victory. Instead, a strange calm settled over our camps, as if everyone understood that what was about to happen would be different from all our previous battles. Men wrote letters by candlelight, cleaned their weapons with unusual care, spoke in low voices about things that mattered to them beyond the reach of war. I found myself thinking about my village in France, about harvest time and the smell of fresh bread, about my mother's garden and the way light looked when it slanted through the windows of the church where I had been baptized. These thoughts came unbidden, carrying with them a poignancy I had never felt before battle. It was as if some part of me understood that tomorrow would mark a dividing line, not just in the campaign, but in the life of every man who survived it. Napoleon held his final council of war in a farmhouse near the village of Borodino, and though I was not present for those deliberations, their outcome was clear enough when the orders reached our regiments. We would attack at dawn along the entire line, with the main effort directed against the great redoubt that dominated the Russian center. It would be a straightforward assault, relying on our superior discipline and the Emperor's tactical genius to overcome the advantages of position and preparation that Kutuzov had accumulated. Dawn on September 7, 1812, came gray and cold, with a mist that clung to the valleys and made it difficult to see more than a few hundred yards in any direction. As we formed up for the attack, I could hear the sounds of the Russian army preparing for our assault, the scrape of shovels as they improved their earthworks, the rumble of artillery being repositioned, the low murmur of voices speaking prayers in a language I could not understand but whose meaning was universal. The bombardment began at 6 o'clock, with every gun we could bring to bear opening fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable, not the sharp crack of individual cannon shots, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to make the earth itself vibrate. Through the smoke and mist, I could see the flashes of the Russian guns answering our fire, their shots screaming overhead to explode among our own positions. For 2 hours, the artillery duel continued, each side trying to weaken the other before the infantry assault began. The noise was so overwhelming that orders had to be communicated by gesture, and conversation became impossible. Men stood in formation, enduring the bombardment with the stoic patience that marked veteran soldiers, occasionally stepping aside to let stretcher-bearers carry away those struck by enemy fire. When the order finally came to advance, it was almost a relief to move out of the killing ground where we had been standing and into the relative activity of assault. My regiment was part of the attack on the Russian left, aimed at a series of earthworks called the flèches that protected the approach to the Great Redoubt. As we advanced across the open ground, the mist began to lift, revealing the full extent of the Russian position and the careful preparation that had gone into its defense. The first assault failed. We reached the earthworks, struggled over the parapets, and found ourselves facing Russian infantry who fought with a determination that was beyond anything we had encountered before. These were not soldiers conducting a fighting withdrawal or manning positions they intended to abandon. These were men defending ground they meant to hold, and they fought like it. The second assault also failed, though we held the forward positions longer before being driven back by a Russian counterattack that swept down from the heights like an avalanche. I found myself lying in a shell crater, breathing heavily, my uniform torn and my musket fouled with powder residue, listening to the screams of wounded men and the distant sound of drums calling our scattered companies back to their starting positions. The third assault began at noon, after another artillery bombardment that left the earthworks looking like the surface of the moon. By now, the careful formations we had started with had dissolved into something more primitive, groups of men following their officers forward, driven by a mixture of duty, desperation, and the simple momentum of violence that takes hold in prolonged combat. This time, we took the flèches and held them. The cost was appalling. I could see bodies piled 3 deep in some of the gun positions, but we had gained our first real foothold in the Russian defenses. From the captured earthworks, we could see the Great Redoubt looming ahead of us, its guns still firing, its ramparts still crowded with enemy soldiers who showed no sign of withdrawing. The assault on the Great Redoubt began in mid-afternoon, after what felt like hours of preparation but was probably only minutes. Every available man was thrown into the attack: infantry, cavalry, artillery crews fighting as foot soldiers, engineers, even some of the Imperial Guard. The approaches to the position were carpeted with bodies from previous assaults, making footing treacherous and adding a psychological horror to the physical danger of the advance. I have tried, in the years since, to describe what it was like to climb those bloody slopes under fire from dozens of cannon and thousands of muskets, but words seem inadequate to capture the reality of that experience. The air was thick with smoke and screaming metal, the ground soft with blood and torn earth, the horizon limited to the next few yards of slope that had to be climbed before reaching whatever shelter lay ahead. When we finally reached the ramparts of the Great Redoubt, the fighting became hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, musket but against sword, desperation against desperation. The Russian gunners fought over their pieces like men defending their own homes, and perhaps, in a sense, we were not just taking a position, we were driving them from the last significant obstacle between our army and their ancient capital. The redoubt fell finally, not through any brilliant tactical maneuver, but through the simple arithmetic of casualties. We had more men to throw into the fighting, and eventually, the Russian defenders were overwhelmed by numbers rather than defeated by superior skill or courage. When the last gun was silenced and the last defender driven from the position, those of us who remained standing looked around at what we had purchased with so much blood. The view from the redoubt was magnificent and terrible. Behind us, the battlefield stretched away toward our starting positions, marked by the dark lines where our attacks had advanced and fallen back, by the scattered equipment of the dead and wounded, by the gun positions that had been taken and retaken multiple times during the day's fighting. Ahead of us, the road to Moscow lay open, defended now only by the remnants of Kutuzov's army as they conducted their withdrawal in good order. We had won. The field was ours, the road was open, the enemy was retreating. By every measure that European warfare recognized, the Battle of Borodino was a French victory. Napoleon himself proclaimed it so in his dispatches to Paris, describing the defeat of the Russian army and the opening of the path to Moscow. The regimental bands played victory marches as we reformed our shattered units and prepared to continue the advance. But victory had never felt so much like defeat. The cost had been staggering, over 30,000 French casualties in a single day, losses that our army could not afford and could not replace. Entire regiments had been reduced to company strength. Veteran units that had fought across Europe were now shadows of their former selves, led by junior officers because their senior commanders lay dead on the slopes of the Great Redoubt. Worse than the casualties was the realization that our victory had accomplished nothing meaningful. The Russian army had not been destroyed. It had withdrawn in good order, taking its artillery and most of its equipment, ready to fight again another day. We had gained a few miles of blood-soaked ground and the dubious privilege of burying our dead in Russian soil, but we were no closer to ending the campaign than we had been the morning before. As night fell on the battlefield, the true cost of our victory became apparent. The fields around Borodino were carpeted with bodies, French and Russian lying together in the democratic embrace of death. The wounded cried out in a dozen languages, their voices creating a chorus of suffering that could be heard for miles. Stretcher-bearers worked by torchlight, trying to separate the living from the dead, but there were too many casualties and too few medical personnel to cope with the disaster. I spent that night helping to carry wounded men to the field hospitals, walking again and again across ground that had been fought over multiple times during the day. Each trip revealed new horrors. Young soldiers calling for their mothers in their final moments, veteran sergeants trying to direct their men even as they bled to death from wounds that no surgeon could repair, horses screaming in pain from injuries that would require them to be destroyed. The hospitals themselves were scenes from hell. Surgeons worked without rest, amputating limbs by candlelight, their aprons soaked with blood, their instruments dulled from overuse. The supply of laudanum and brandy, the only anesthetics available, had been exhausted hours earlier, and men endured operations that would have been unbearable under the best of circumstances while fully conscious and in agony. Napoleon visited the wounded that night, moving among the dying men with words of comfort and promises of care that everyone knew could not be kept. I watched him stop beside a young grenadier who had lost both legs to a cannonball, saw him lean down to whisper something in the boy's ear that brought a brief smile to his face before the light faded from his eyes forever. The emperor's face, when he thought no one was watching, revealed the truth that his public demeanor concealed. This was not the kind of victory he had expected, not the decisive engagement that would force the Tsar to sue for peace. This was a Pyrrhic triumph that had cost us more than we could afford while gaining us nothing that could justify the expenditure. As dawn broke on September 8th, revealing the full extent of the carnage, we began the grim task of burying the dead and preparing to continue our advance toward Moscow. The Russian forces had withdrawn during the night, leaving us in possession of a battlefield that no one wanted to possess, masters of ground that had been purchased at a price that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. The march toward Moscow resumed that morning, but the army that moved eastward from Borodino was fundamentally different from the one that had fought there the day before. We had crossed another threshold, darker and more final than the Neman River. We were no longer conquerors advancing toward inevitable triumph. We were survivors of a battle that had revealed the true cost of our enterprise and the true nature of the enemy we faced. The road ahead led toward Moscow, toward whatever destiny awaited us in the ancient capital of Russia. But behind us, on the blood-soaked fields of Borodino, lay the graves of more than 70,000 men who had paid the ultimate price for a victory that solved nothing, proved nothing, and brought us no closer to the peace we had crossed the Neman to achieve. In winning the day, we had lost something precious and irreplaceable. the belief that our cause was just and our victory inevitable. Part 4. Moscow burns. September-October 1812. The first sight of Moscow's golden domes and white walls rising from the horizon should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of 3 months of marching and fighting across the breadth of European Russia. Instead, as our advanced guard crested the final hills on September 14, 1812, the ancient capital appeared before us like a mirage, beautiful, ethereal, and somehow unreal, as if it might vanish the moment we tried to grasp it. I was among the troops who entered the city that first day, our boots echoing on cobblestones that had known the tread of Mongol horses and the carriages of tsars. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not the peaceful quiet of a city at rest, but the oppressive stillness of a place that had been deliberately emptied of life. Windows stared down at us like blind eyes. Doors hung open on houses that had been abandoned so recently that the smell of cooking still lingered in some of the kitchens. Moscow was vast beyond anything we had imagined. Street after street of wooden houses stretched away in all directions, punctuated by the onion domes of countless churches and the imposing facades of palaces that spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries. The Kremlin itself dominated the city center like a medieval fortress, its red walls enclosing a complex of buildings that seemed to embody the mystery and power of the Russian Empire. But the city was empty, not partially evacuated, not defended by a skeleton garrison. Completely, utterly empty. The population of nearly 300,000 souls had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Governor Rostofin had organized the evacuation with the same thorough efficiency that had characterized every Russian action since we crossed the Neman, removing not just people but everything portable that might be useful to an occupying army. Napoleon himself entered Moscow later that day, riding through the deserted streets with an entourage that tried to maintain the dignity appropriate to the conquest of an enemy capital. But there was something hollow about the procession, something that reminded me of actors performing a play for an empty theater. We had captured Moscow, but Moscow had somehow eluded us even in its capture. The emperor took up residence in the Kremlin, establishing his headquarters in the same apartments that had housed the tsars for generations. From the windows of those ancient chambers, he could look out over a city that was nominally his to command, but which felt more like an elaborate trap than a prize. The reports that reached him throughout that first day all carried the same message. The city was ours, but it was also useless. The arsenals had been emptied, their weapons removed or destroyed. The granaries contained nothing but dust and emptiness. The treasury had been evacuated along with the government. Even the fire engines had been taken away, leaving the city defenseless against the one enemy that would soon prove more dangerous than any army: fire itself. I remember the eerie experience of billeting in a Moscow mansion that first night, walking through rooms that still held the warmth and scent of their recent occupants. Family portraits stared down from the walls, children's toys lay scattered on the floors, and dinner tables were set for meals that would never be eaten. It was as if the entire population had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the physical shell of their lives. The fires began the next night, September 15th, starting in different parts of the city simultaneously. At first, we assumed they were accidental. Candles left burning in abandoned houses, cooking fires that had not been properly extinguished, the inevitable result of quartering a large army in wooden buildings that had been hastily evacuated. But as the fires spread and multiplied, it became clear that this was no accident. The blazes had been set systematically, according to a plan that had been prepared in advance and executed with military precision. Russian agents, left behind for this specific purpose, moved through the city under cover of darkness, igniting fires that had been carefully positioned to spread quickly and cause maximum damage. By morning, entire districts were engulfed in flames that our soldiers were powerless to extinguish. The sight of Moscow burning was both magnificent and terrible. The fires created their own weather, generating winds that carried sparks across vast distances and ignited new blazes faster than the old ones could be contained. The smoke rose in towering columns that could be seen for dozens of miles, creating a pillar of fire and cloud that marked the location of what had once been the heart of the Russian Empire. I found myself assigned to one of the firefighting details that worked desperately to save what remained of the city. But our efforts were hampered by the lack of proper equipment. The fire engines had been removed along with everything else of value, and by the sheer scale of the conflagration. We formed bucket brigades with water drawn from the Moscow River, but it was like trying to extinguish a volcano with a garden watering can. The heat was indescribable. Even blocks away from the main fires, the air shimmered with thermal distortion that made it difficult to see clearly. The smoke burned our eyes and throats, making breathing a conscious effort that left us gasping and dizzy. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion even as they worked to combat the flames, and several soldiers were killed when burning buildings collapsed without warning. As the fires spread, they began to consume the very resources we had hoped to find in Moscow. Warehouses full of supplies that might have sustained our army through the winter became infernos that lit the night sky. Libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge burned like enormous torches, their smoke carrying with it the ashes of irreplaceable manuscripts and documents. Churches whose golden domes had gleamed in the sunlight became furnaces that melted their own bells and reduced priceless icons to charcoal. Napoleon watched the destruction from the windows of the Kremlin, his face illuminated by the glow of the burning city. The sight seemed to affect him profoundly, not just the loss of the supplies and shelter we desperately needed, but the symbolic impact of Russia's willingness to destroy its own ancient capital rather than let it serve enemy purposes. This was sacrifice on a scale that challenged every assumption we had made about civilized warfare. For 5 days, Moscow burned. When the fires finally began to subside, more than 3/4 of the city had been reduced to ash and rubble. What had been one of Europe's largest and most magnificent cities was now a wasteland of charred timbers and smoking ruins, interrupted only by the occasional building that had somehow escaped the general conflagration. The surviving structures stood like islands in a sea of destruction, their walls blackened with smoke, their windows empty sockets staring out at the desolation. The great churches, built of stone rather than wood, had survived the fires but were gutted and roofless, their interiors reduced to ash-covered shells where the wind whistled through broken windows like the voices of ghosts. Our situation, precarious before the fires, now became desperate. The army was quartered in ruins that provided little shelter from the increasingly cold nights. The supplies we had hoped to find in Moscow had literally gone up in smoke, leaving us dependent on a supply line that stretched back across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Winter was approaching, and we found ourselves in possession of a city that could neither feed nor house the army that had conquered it. Disease, which had been a persistent problem throughout the campaign, now became a crisis. The smoke and ash had contaminated much of the city's water supply, while the stress of the fires and the constant work of fighting them had weakened men who were already worn down by months of hard campaigning. Dysentery, typhus, and respiratory ailments spread rapidly through units that were living in close quarters amid the ruins. The field hospitals, what few remained functional, became overwhelmed with casualties from the fires as well as ongoing cases of disease and battle wounds that had never properly healed. Surgeons worked without adequate supplies in buildings that reeked of smoke and provided little protection from the weather. Men died not from enemy action but from the simple inability of our medical services to cope with the accumulated burden of months of hardship. Morale, which had briefly risen with our entry into Moscow, now plummeted to levels I had never witnessed in any army. Soldiers who had endured the retreat from Smolensk and the carnage at Borodino now found themselves camping in ruins, sustained by ever shorter rations, watching the approach of winter with growing desperation. Conversations around the evening campfires turned from discussions of victory to quiet speculation about whether we would ever see home again. Desertion, previously rare in the Grande Armée, began to increase dramatically. Men simply walked away from their units during the night, preferring to take their chances on the road back toward Poland rather than remain with an army that seemed to be consuming itself. Some were caught and brought back for punishment, but many more disappeared into the vast Russian wilderness, never to be seen again. Napoleon himself seemed affected by the transformation of his great victory into a hollow triumph. His daily routine continued: meetings with his marshals, reviews of intelligence reports, the dictation of dispatches to Paris that maintained the fiction that all was proceeding according to plan. But those who saw him regularly noticed changes. He aged visibly during those weeks in Moscow, his face taking on lines that had not been there at Borodino, his eyes reflecting a awareness that the campaign had taken a direction no amount of tactical genius could correct. The emperor's attempts to negotiate with Tsar Alexander met with silence. Envoys sent to the Russian court returned with reports that their messages had been ignored, their presence barely acknowledged. The Russians had decided that time was their ally, that winter would accomplish what their armies had been unable to achieve. They were prepared to let Moscow burn rather than grant Napoleon the diplomatic victory that might have saved his enterprise. As September turned to October, the first light snows began to dust the blackened ruins of Moscow. The snowflakes, pristine white against the charred timber and stone, created a contrast that was both beautiful and ominous. Each flake that fell was a reminder that we had remained too long in this burned-out shell of a city, that every day we delayed our departure brought us closer to a catastrophe that no military genius could prevent. The army's condition continued to deteriorate. Units that had entered Moscow with some semblance of order and discipline began to disintegrate under the combined pressure of inadequate supplies, impossible living conditions, and the psychological impact of occupying a city that felt more like a graveyard than a conquest. Soldiers who had marched proudly across Europe now spent their days scavenging for food and fuel among the ruins. Looting, which had been strictly controlled during the early stages of the campaign, became endemic as men desperate for supplies broke into the few remaining intact buildings in search of anything that might help them survive. The careful distinctions between military objectives and civilian property, between legitimate requisition and theft, collapsed under the pressure of necessity. October nights grew longer and colder, and with each passing day, it became more obvious that our position was untenable. We could not remain in Moscow through the winter. The city could not support us. But leaving meant abandoning the goal for which we had sacrificed so much, admitting that our great enterprise had failed despite every tactical success. The snow that fell more frequently now reminded us that time was running out. Soon, the roads would become impassable, the countryside even more hostile than it already was. If we were to preserve any part of the army that had crossed the Neman with such confidence, we would have to begin our retreat while movement was still possible. Yet Napoleon delayed, hoping perhaps for a message from St. Petersburg that never came, clinging to the possibility that Russia might still acknowledge the logic of defeat. Each day of delay was a day lost, a day closer to the winter that would prove more deadly than any enemy army. But the emperor seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what leaving would mean, the admission that all our sacrifices had been for nothing, that we had traded the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers for the privilege of camping in the ruins of a city we could neither hold nor use. Moscow burned around us, and in its ashes lay the cremated remains of our hopes for a quick and decisive campaign. We had reached the ancient capital of Russia, the prize that was supposed to justify every hardship. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in a monument to the enemy's willingness to sacrifice everything rather than submit. The fires that consumed Moscow illuminated a terrible truth. We were no longer the conquerors of Europe, but exiles in a land that would give us nothing except the opportunity to count the true cost of our ambition. Part 5. Retreat and Winter, October-November 1812. October 19, 1812. The date burns in my memory like a brand, marking the moment when Napoleon finally acknowledged what the rest of us had known for weeks. Our position in Moscow was hopeless, and every day we remained brought us closer to complete catastrophe. The order to begin the retreat came without fanfare, without the usual proclamations about strategic redeployment or tactical withdrawals. It was simply time to leave, to abandon the prize for which we had sacrificed so much, and to attempt the long journey back to lands where winter was not an enemy as implacable as any human foe. The weather had turned with October's arrival, bringing the first serious taste of Russian winter. Frost painted the blackened ruins of Moscow with silver each morning, and the wind that swept across the steppes carried promises of worse to come. Those of us who had served in northern campaigns knew the signs, the particular quality of light that speaks of snow to come, the way metal becomes painful to touch with bare hands, the manner in which breath begins to steam in the air. But this would be different from any winter campaign we had previously endured. We were not fighting our way into winter quarters prepared in advance, with supply lines secured and magazines stocked for a season of reduced activity. We were beginning a retreat of hundreds of miles across hostile territory, carrying what supplies we could manage and leaving behind everything that might slow our movement. The very survival of the army now depended on reaching friendly territory before the worst of winter made travel impossible. The exodus from Moscow began in the pre-dawn darkness, with units forming up amid the ruins and beginning their march westward along the Kaluga road. Napoleon had hoped to take a southern route that would lead us through regions not yet devastated by our advance, areas where we might still find supplies and where the roads might be in better condition. It was a reasonable plan, but like so many reasonable plans in this campaign, it failed to account for the ingenuity and determination of our enemies. The first day's march was almost pleasant, despite the circumstances. The morning was crisp but not brutally cold. The road was firm under our feet, and the simple act of movement felt liberating after weeks of camping in the ruins of the burned city. There was even a sense of optimism among some of the men. We were finally heading home, putting distance between ourselves and this cursed country that had cost us so much. But that optimism would not survive the first week. The Russian armies that had shadowed our advance into their homeland now positioned themselves to contest our retreat. Unlike the fighting withdrawal they had conducted during our advance, they now harassed us with a confidence born of their knowledge that time and weather were fighting on their side. Every river crossing became a battle, every village a potential ambush, every mile purchased with casualties we could not afford. Murat's cavalry, which had been the pride of the army since our first campaigns in Italy, began to disintegrate with shocking speed. The horses, weakened by months of inadequate fodder and hard service, could not cope with the increasing cold and the demands of constant skirmishing. I watched magnificent chargers that had carried their riders across the battlefields of Europe stumble and fall, their strength finally exhausted, leaving cavalrymen to continue on foot with whatever equipment they could carry. The artillery suffered even worse. As horses died or became too weak to pull their loads, cannon after cannon was abandoned by the roadside. These were not obsolete pieces or captured enemy guns, but the pride of the French artillery. Bronze beauties that had thundered at Austerlitz and Wagram, instruments of war that represented decades of military evolution and countless hours of skilled craftsmanship. Watching them left behind like broken furniture was almost more demoralizing than human casualties. The cold was unlike anything most of us had ever experienced. It was not the clean, sharp cold of a European winter, but something that seemed to penetrate to the very bone, sapping strength and will with each breath of the knife-like air. Metal became brittle, leather cracked, and wool provided inadequate protection against a cold that seemed designed specifically to kill human beings foolish enough to venture into its domain. My own equipment began to fail within days of leaving Moscow. The straps on my pack, made of leather that had served me faithfully for years, became brittle and snapped without warning. My musket, cleaned and maintained with religious regularity throughout the campaign, began to jam as moisture froze in its mechanism. Most critically, my boots, good French boots that had carried me across half of Europe, began to fall apart as the cold made the glue brittle and the stitching weak. Food became an obsession that dominated every conversation, every thought, every dream. The supplies we had been able to carry from Moscow were exhausted within days, and the countryside through which we marched had been systematically stripped of anything edible. We began to eat things that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks before. Tree bark boiled into a bitter soup, leather from abandoned equipment softened over fires until it could be chewed, grass and roots that provided little nutrition but at least filled empty bellies temporarily. The horses died first, and their meat became precious beyond description. A dead cavalry mount could feed a company for days, providing not just protein but fat that helped protect against the cold. Men who had once been squeamish about eating anything but properly prepared meat now fought over raw horse meat with the desperation of starving animals. The transformation was as psychological as it was physical, civilized soldiers becoming scavengers driven by the most basic need for survival. Sleep became increasingly difficult as the cold intensified. The ground was frozen hard, making it impossible to dig proper shelter, and fires required constant attention to keep them burning. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing what blankets remained. But body heat was not enough to ward off the kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned exposed skin white within minutes. Frostbite became endemic. I watched soldiers lose fingers and toes to the cold, saw men whose feet had frozen in their boots and who had to be carried by their comrades. The surgeons could do little for these casualties. Amputation was often the only treatment, performed without anesthesia in conditions that made infection almost inevitable. Many men chose to keep walking on frostbitten feet rather than face the surgeon's saw, preferring the hope of eventual healing to the certainty of mutilation. The retreat took on a rhythm of its own, dictated not by military necessity but by the simple requirements of survival. We walked during the day, when the weak sun provided a tiny measure of warmth, and tried to rest during the night, though rest in such conditions was more like a temporary cessation of movement than actual sleep. The pace was set by the weakest members of each unit, and as men became weaker, the entire army slowed to a crawl. Discipline, which had been the foundation of our military success, began to break down under the pressure of shared misery. Officers who had once commanded instant obedience now found their authority questioned by men who were too exhausted and desperate to care about rank or regulations. The careful hierarchy that had characterized the Grande Armée gave way to a more primitive social organization based on the ability to find food, provide warmth, or simply continue moving. The baggage train, which had once stretched for miles behind the fighting units, gradually disappeared as wagons broke down or were abandoned. Personal possessions that had seemed important in peacetime became deadweight that sapped precious energy. I watched men discard books, letters from home, even weapons as the simple act of carrying unnecessary weight became unbearable. Napoleon himself seemed to age years during those terrible weeks. The man who had once inspired confidence through his very presence now rode in a carriage, wrapped in furs, his face gaunt and his eyes reflecting an awareness that his great enterprise was collapsing around him. He still issued orders, still received reports from his marshals, but there was something hollow about these activities, as if everyone involved understood that the real decisions were now being made by the weather and the enemy rather than by human commanders. November brought snow, and with it a new level of suffering that reduced our previous hardships to mere inconvenience by comparison. The first serious snowfall came on November 4th, beginning as light flakes that seemed almost benign but quickly developing into a blizzard that made travel impossible and visibility nearly zero. We huddled in whatever shelter we could find, burning furniture and equipment to stay alive, while the snow piled up around us like a white shroud. When the storm finally passed, we emerged to find a landscape transformed. The roads had disappeared under drifts that reached above a man's waist in places, while the familiar landmarks we had been using for navigation were buried or disguised beyond recognition. The snow continued to fall intermittently, each new accumulation making movement more difficult and increasing the energy required for the simplest tasks. Walking through deep snow in inadequate boots with insufficient food became a form of torture that tested the limits of human endurance. Each step required conscious effort, and the energy expended was far greater than what our meager rations could replace. Men began to fall out of the columns not from wounds or disease, but from simple exhaustion, lying down in the snow to rest and never getting up again. The temperature dropped to levels that made exposed skin painful within minutes and potentially fatal within hours. Breath froze in the air, creating ice crystals that cut the lungs, while metal equipment became so cold that touching it with bare skin would leave frost burns. The wind, when it blew, was like a living thing intent on finding every gap in our clothing and exploiting every weakness in our defenses against the cold. Wolves began to follow the army, attracted by the scent of death that now surrounded us constantly. They were patient predators, content to wait for stragglers to collapse before moving in for easy prey. The sound of their howling at night added a psychological torment to our physical sufferings, reminding us that we had become food for scavengers in a land that wanted us dead. The Russian forces that continued to harass our retreat seemed immune to the cold that was killing us. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking at our rear guard and flanks before melting back into the landscape they knew so well. Their Cossack cavalry was particularly effective, using their superior knowledge of the terrain and their adaptation to winter conditions to inflict casualties that were small individually but cumulatively devastating. Sleep became a deadly luxury. Men who lay down to rest in the snow often never woke up, their bodies found frozen solid by the morning watch. Those who did survive the nights often suffered from frostbite so severe that they could no longer walk effectively. The evening halt, once a welcome relief from the day's march, became a test of will as much as endurance. Staying awake and moving became literally a matter of life and death. Food procurement took on the character of desperate scavenging. We ate anything that might provide calories. Candles made from animal fat, leather from abandoned equipment, even paper when it could be found. The dead, both human and animal, were searched for anything edible before the cold froze them solid. The moral boundaries that had once seemed absolute dissolved under the pressure of starvation and the knowledge that failure to eat meant certain death. The army was now a long column of refugees rather than a military force. Units had lost all resemblance to their original organization, with men from different regiments and nationalities mixed together in groups held together only by shared misery and the common goal of survival. French grenadiers marched alongside Bavarian infantry and Polish lancers, their national identities subsumed in the larger identity of the suffering. Officers attempted to maintain some semblance of military order, but their authority was increasingly based on their ability to help their men survive rather than on their rank or position. Those commanders who shared the hardships of their troops retained some measure of respect and obedience, while those who attempted to maintain privileges or exemptions found themselves abandoned by men who had no energy to waste on military courtesies. The hospitals that traveled with the army became scenes of indescribable horror. Wounded men who might have recovered under normal conditions died from exposure or infection as medical supplies ran out and proper shelter became impossible to maintain. Surgeons worked without instruments, bandages, or medicine, often amputating frostbitten limbs with improvised tools in conditions that guaranteed infection. November 28th marked the approach to the Berezina River, where our route would cross a significant water barrier that Russian forces were already moving to contest. The mere prospect of having to fight a battle in our current conditions seemed almost absurd, but the alternative was to remain where we were and face certain destruction from cold and starvation. The cold had become so intense that muskets would not fire reliably. Artillery pieces were abandoned for lack of horses to pull them, and men moved like automatons driven by will alone. We were no longer an army in any meaningful sense. We were the remnants of an army, a procession of ghosts stumbling through a landscape that seemed designed to erase all trace of our passage. Behind us, the road was marked by the dark spots where men had fallen and been covered by snow, by abandoned equipment that would remain buried until spring, by the bones of horses that had served faithfully until their strength was exhausted. We were leaving a trail that told the story of our dissolution, each mile marked by the evidence of what the Russian winter could do to men who had ventured too far from home. The sound of the Berezina's waters, when we finally heard it in the distance, was both welcome and terrifying. Welcome because it meant we were still making progress toward safety. Terrifying because we all knew that crossing a river in winter, pursued by enemies and weakened by months of hardship, would test whatever remained of our collective will to survive. The river would be our next trial, and we approached it knowing that many of us would not see the far shore. Part 6. The Berezina, November 1812. The Berezina River appeared before us on November 26th like a judgment rendered in ice and black water. After weeks of struggling through snow that grew deeper with each passing day, after watching our army transform from the finest military force in Europe into a desperate procession of frozen scarecrows, we had reached the barrier that would determine whether any fragment of the Grande Armée would survive to tell the tale of our Russian adventure. The river itself was perhaps 150 feet wide at the crossing point near Borisov, its dark waters flowing sluggishly between banks lined with bare trees that stood like skeletal sentinels in the winter landscape. Under normal circumstances, it would have presented no significant obstacle to an organized army with proper equipment and engineering support. But these were not normal circumstances, and we were no longer an organized army. The bridges at Borisov had been destroyed by the Russians, of course. We had expected nothing else. Every river crossing since leaving Moscow had required us to find alternative means of passage, and the Berezina was too important strategically for the enemy to leave intact. What we had not fully anticipated was the extent to which Admiral Sheshagov's army would contest our crossing, or the degree to which our own capabilities had been degraded by the terrible march from the burning capital. I remember standing on the eastern bank that first morning, looking across the water at the far shore that represented our only hope of eventual salvation. The Russian positions were clearly visible through the bare trees. Artillery batteries positioned to sweep the river with fire, infantry formations ready to repel any assault, cavalry units prepared to exploit any breakthrough or pursue any retreat. Between us and them lay dark water that was cold enough to kill a man in minutes and obstacles that seemed almost insurmountable given our current condition. Napoleon himself arrived at the riverbank that afternoon, riding in a simple sleigh rather than the elaborate carriage that had carried him from Moscow. The transformation in his appearance since we had entered the Russian capital was shocking to those of us who had grown accustomed to his commanding presence on European battlefields. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his famous gray overcoat hanging loose on a frame that had lost the solid presence that once inspired confidence in impossible situations. But his mind remained sharp, and within hours of his arrival, he had developed a plan that demonstrated the tactical genius that had made him master of Europe. While a portion of our remaining forces would conduct a feint downstream at Borisov, drawing Russian attention and resources, the main crossing would take place upstream at the village of Studienka, where our engineers would attempt to construct bridges that could carry what remained of the army to safety. The engineering challenges were staggering. We lacked proper materials for bridge construction. The Russians had removed or destroyed everything useful for miles around. We had insufficient tools, inadequate manpower, and no time to conduct the careful preparation that such an operation normally required. Worse, we would have to work in full view of enemy forces who could be expected to do everything possible to disrupt our efforts. General Ebel, our chief engineer, accepted the assignment with the stoic professionalism that had characterized his entire career. A man of perhaps 60 years, worn down by months of hard campaigning but still possessed of the technical knowledge and moral authority necessary for such a desperate undertaking, he began organizing the available resources with a methodical competence that provided the only ray of hope in our otherwise desperate situation. The materials for bridge construction came from the most unlikely sources. Houses in the nearby villages were dismantled for their timber, wooden objects were requisitioned from anyone who still possessed them, and metal fittings were salvaged from abandoned equipment. The nails and iron pieces necessary to hold the structures together came from horseshoes pulled from dead animals, from the metal fittings of discarded weapons, from anything that could be bent or hammered into usefulness. The work began on November 25th, conducted in temperatures that made manual labor almost impossible. The men assigned to the construction details worked in shifts, their hands becoming so numb that they could barely grip tools, their bodies shaking with cold that penetrated to the bone despite the physical exertion. Those not directly involved in building the bridges gathered whatever combustible material could be found, maintaining fires that provided the only source of warmth for workers who periodically had to stop to restore feeling to their extremities. The river itself presented challenges that went beyond the mere matter of spanning its width. The water was cold enough to kill almost instantly, and several men were lost during the early stages of construction when they fell from improvised scaffolding or had their footing slip on ice-covered timber. The current, while not particularly strong, was sufficient to carry away anything that was not securely anchored, and the anchoring itself required driving stakes into a riverbed that was frozen solid. Construction continued through the night of November 25th and into the morning of November 26th, illuminated by fires that cast dancing shadows on the dark water and created an almost hellish scene of desperate industry. The sound of hammering and sawing echoed across the water, occasionally punctuated by Russian artillery fire that served as a reminder that our enemies were aware of our activities and were preparing their response. By dawn on November 26th, 2 bridges had been completed, one for infantry and one for artillery and vehicles. They were not the solid, carefully engineered structures that our armies had used in previous campaigns, but improvised affairs that swayed under load and creaked ominously with every step. However, they were functional, and functionality was all that mattered when the alternative was remaining on the eastern bank to face certain destruction. The crossing began immediately, with the first units moving across the infantry bridge in single file. The process was painfully slow. The bridges could accommodate only a few men at a time, and the slightest disruption could create delays that backed up for miles. Each man who crossed represented both a small victory and a reminder of how many thousands more were still waiting their turn on the eastern bank. The Russian artillery opened fire as soon as the first soldiers reached the western bank, their shots falling among the crossing troops and creating panic that threatened to bring down the bridges through sheer weight of bodies. Men pushed and shoved in their desperation to cross, and several fell into the water where they disappeared beneath the dark surface within seconds. The bridges themselves swayed and groaned under loads they had never been designed to bear. I crossed on the morning of November 27th, as part of a unit assigned to establish defensive positions on the western bank. The experience of walking across that improvised bridge, feeling it flex and sway with each step while Russian artillery fire created geysers of water nearby, remains one of the most terrifying memories of the entire campaign. The planks were slippery with ice and blood from men who had been wounded during the crossing, and the gaps between boards allowed glimpses of the black water that waited to claim anyone unlucky enough to fall. The western bank, when I finally reached it, was a chaos of men and equipment scattered across marshy ground that provided little cover from enemy fire. Units had lost all semblance of organization during the crossing, and officers were struggling to reform their commands while under pressure from Russian attacks that came from multiple directions. The defensive positions we managed to establish were hasty affairs, earthworks scraped from frozen ground, barriers improvised from whatever materials could be found. Throughout November 27th, the bridges carried a steady stream of survivors, but the process was agonizingly slow and costly. Russian artillery fire took a constant toll on the crossing troops, while Cossack attacks on the eastern bank added pressure that forced men to attempt the crossing before they were properly organized. The bridges themselves began to show signs of damage from overuse and enemy fire, requiring constant repairs that had to be conducted under the most dangerous conditions. The artillery and baggage train presented special challenges. The heavy guns that remained to us could not cross the infantry bridge, and the vehicle bridge, while stronger, was narrow and required careful maneuvering that was difficult to achieve under fire. Cannon after cannon was abandoned on the eastern bank as their crews concluded that the risk of attempting to move them across was too great. Wagons loaded with the wounded and what remained of our supplies created bottlenecks that exposed hundreds of men to prolonged enemy fire. Napoleon himself crossed on the afternoon of November 27th, his passage marking a symbolic moment that many interpreted as the abandonment of those still trapped on the eastern bank. The emperor's departure was conducted with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, but there was something final about it, as if his crossing the river marked the end of the campaign in all but name. November 28th brought the crisis we had all been dreading. The combination of constant use, enemy fire, and structural weaknesses caused the vehicle bridge to partially collapse during the morning hours, trapping hundreds of wagons and their escort troops on the eastern bank. Attempts to repair the damage were hampered by continued Russian pressure and the deteriorating condition of the remaining materials. The scenes on the eastern bank that final day were beyond description. Thousands of men, wounded soldiers, camp followers, and civilians who had attached themselves to the army during our retreat were trapped between the river and approaching Russian forces. The single remaining bridge could accommodate only a fraction of those who desperately needed to cross, and panic began to spread through the crowd as the realization grew that many would be left behind. Fights broke out among groups trying to force their way onto the bridge, with men who had marched together for months now competing desperately for spaces that represented the difference between life and death. Officers tried to maintain some semblance of order, but their authority was meaningless to civilians who saw the bridge as their only hope of survival. The sound of the crowd, screaming, crying, pleading, created a chorus of despair that could be heard across the water. The Russian assault on the eastern bank began in earnest during the afternoon, with artillery fire followed by infantry and cavalry attacks that drove our rear guard back toward the river. Men caught between the advancing enemy and the water faced impossible choices: fight hopeless battles against overwhelming odds, attempt to swim across water that would kill them within minutes, or surrender to captors who were unlikely to show mercy to invaders who had devastated their homeland. General Partenoz's division, which had been covering our retreat, was overwhelmed and forced to surrender en masse. Nearly 4,000 men who became prisoners rather than casualties, though their ultimate fate would prove little different. The sight of an entire formation laying down its arms was perhaps more demoralizing than watching men die in battle, as it represented the final collapse of military discipline and effectiveness. As darkness fell on November 28th, the engineers made the terrible decision to destroy the remaining bridge to prevent its use by Russian forces. The explosion that sent the improvised structure into the dark water also cut the lifeline for thousands of people still trapped on the eastern bank. Their cries echoed across the water through the night, gradually fading as cold and Russian bullets took their toll. The survivors who had made it across the Berezina numbered perhaps 30,000, a fraction of the force that had entered Moscow just weeks earlier. We were no longer an army in any meaningful sense, but rather a collection of refugee groups held together by shared trauma and the dim hope that we might somehow reach friendly territory before winter finished what the Russians had begun. The crossing of the Berezina became, in later years, a symbol of both military disaster and human courage. The engineers who built bridges from nothing, the soldiers who maintained discipline under impossible conditions, the officers who shared the hardships of their men, all demonstrated that something noble could emerge from even the most desperate circumstances. But the cost had been staggering, and the river claimed more victims than any battle we had fought. As we stumbled away from the Berezina on November 29th, leaving behind thousands of our comrades and the remnants of our equipment, the sound of the dark water continued to haunt our steps. It carried with it the voices of those we had been forced to abandon, the echo of our own mortality, and the knowledge that we had crossed more than just a river. We had crossed the boundary between hope and despair, between the army we had been and the ghosts we were becoming. The road ahead led toward the Niemen, toward the border we had crossed with such confidence just 5 months earlier. But that border now seemed as distant as the moon, and those of us who still possessed the strength to walk understood that reaching it would require miracles that our situation no longer seemed capable of producing. Behind us, the Berezina flowed on through the winter night, indifferent to human suffering, carrying away the last pretenses of our great enterprise like debris from a disaster whose magnitude was only beginning to be understood.